In the heart of the city of Nishapur, nestled among the narrow alleyways of a quiet district just beyond the bazaar, sat a modest but significant building, the library of the Buyid dynasty's provincial court. The year was 997 CE, and while the world outside bustled with merchants, scholars, and the occasional writer from Baghdad, one man moved deliberately inside the domed walls of this unassuming institution. His name was Abu Zaid, son of a minor official and keeper of the city's manuscript library. You would not have noticed him in a crowd. His turban was plain, the hem of his robe frayed. His voice rarely rose above a whisper. But to the world of Persian scholarship, men like him formed the unseen threads that held knowledge together. The dawn routine. Abu Zaid rose before the muezzin's first call. His day, like many in his city, began with ablutions, cold water poured from a brass pitcher into a cracked earthen basin. He recited the Fajr prayer not in a mosque, but in the small courtyard of his home, shaded by an old pomegranate tree. Then came the morning inspection of his tools. The brass key to the library, a jar of ink prepared the night before with soot, gum arabic, and water, his reed pens shaved to various widths, and a worn ledger bound in goatskin. This ledger did not contain secrets or theology but lists so many lists: borrowed books, damaged scrolls, repairs to the roof, lantern oil expenses. He carried these with the gentle pride of a man whose duties were humble but unshakably precise. Entering the library. The library itself was a waqf and endowment established by a Buyid vizier decades earlier. It sat adjacent to a madrasa but operated independently. The entryway was modest, flanked by worn sandstone columns and capped with a wooden lintel carved with Quranic script and floral motifs. The ritual of opening was important. First, Abu Zaid would unbolt the heavy wooden door and step inside to the smell of aged parchment, dust, and oil. He would light the lanterns, wick by wick, using olive oil stored in small clay jugs. Some lamps hung from the ceiling, others rested near reading niches along the walls. Then he would sweep the floor mats not with a broom, but with a palm frond brush, so as not to stir up too much dust. The silence of the room was not empty. It was thick with the weight of text. Shelves of Arabic, Persian, and translated Greek manuscripts lined the walls, their pages tightly bound in wood or leather covers, tagged with scraps of dyed thread. He would then recite a quiet supplication, not required by duty but born of habit. Morning recordkeeping. Once settled, Abu Zaid would begin the ledger review. The morning was not yet for study or reading, it was for administrative upkeep. He recorded the humidity of the morning estimated from the smell and feel of the air as a note to adjust the ventilation shutters. Moisture, after all, bred mold, and mold destroyed books. He would check the borrowing records, noting that Yusuf al-Tiflisi, a theological student, had not returned his copy of Kitab al-Tawhid on time. Abu Zaid would make a small note: 3 days overdue. Student warned last week. Then came inspection of the shelves. He ran his fingers along the bindings, looking for fraying threads or signs of bookworm damage. The culprits were tiny, often unnoticed, but Abu Zaid knew the patterns: pin-sized holes in the leather, telltale sawdust along the shelves. For damage beyond his skills, he maintained a relationship with Harun, the son of a local tanner who had turned to bookbinding. Once every 2 weeks, Abu Zaid would walk a manuscript across town to Harun's workshop, and they would sit in companionable silence as Harun applied paste, stitched the binding, and reinforced the spine. Not that morning, though. The books were still holding strong. Manuscript maintenance. Around mid-morning, Abu Zaid turned to the manuscript inventory. He gently opened a newly arrived copy of Aristotle's Metaphysics, translated into Arabic by Al-Farabi. The ink was still fresh in places. He read a few lines aloud, not for comprehension but to test for smudging, then let the page air dry beside the window slit. He cross-referenced the new manuscript against the existing inventory to avoid duplication. One of the shelves already contained another translation, older and partially damaged by moisture. Should he archive the old one, copy its legible parts? But he hesitated. The older translation had marginalia from an unknown scholar, a mix of commentary and poetry, scribbled in the narrow gutters of the pages. That alone, perhaps, made it worth keeping. He noted in the ledger, second copy acquired, first contains marginalia retain both. There were no dramatic decisions, no visitors knocking, no scholars demanding debate, just ink, paper, and deliberation. A librarian's diet. Abu Zaid's lunch was always the same: flatbread wrapped around crumbled goat cheese, sometimes a few olives, eaten sitting cross-legged beneath the window. He drank from a goatskin flask, filled earlier that morning from the communal well. The meal took perhaps 15 minutes. Then, with slow care, he wiped his hands, dusted his robe, and resumed his place behind the reading table. At noon, he would pause only briefly for dhuhr prayer, sometimes joined by a student or two from the madrasa. But the afternoons, that was when the library began to change. The light shifted, the air warmed, and visitors, though few, might begin to arrive. The fragility of access. Only a handful of people were allowed to borrow books. Most came to read on site, sitting cross-legged at low wooden tables. Abu Zaid would monitor their treatment of the texts with quiet diligence. Any ink stains, torn pages, or dog-eared corners were met not with reprimand, but with a slow, disappointed sigh that could chill the room. Yet access remained fragile. Political winds shifted easily. A new governor could shut the doors on a whim. One scribe's careless fire could reduce the entire collection to ash. Books that had taken months to transcribe could vanish in an hour. And so he worked always, with the sense that what he preserved could be lost at any time. As the afternoon sun crept across the floor mats, Abu Zaid carefully shelved the freshly dried manuscript, its title inscribed in elegant Naskh script, Ma Ba'd al-Tabia, that which comes after nature. What knowledge, he wondered, had they overlooked between the lines? And more pressingly, what would happen if the Buyid vizier who funded the library fell out of favor? The afternoons in Nishapur wore a different texture than the mornings. The noise of the marketplace outside rose with the heat. Caravans from the east rolled into the city gates, their wheels creaking under silk and spice. But inside the library, Abu Zaid's world narrowed further. If the morning was for order and quiet preservation, the afternoon was for the slow, methodical movement of people and the subtle chaos they introduced. The afternoon drift. After completing his noon prayer, Abu Zaid would often unroll a scroll of poetry not to read for pleasure, but to inspect the inkwork, compare styles of calligraphy, or decipher old marginalia that time had dulled into ghost-like smudges. He understood the irony. Most visitors imagined the librarian spent his days immersed in ideas, pondering the mysteries of Avicenna or the metaphysics of Plato. But a librarian's job truly was material: paper, pigment, thread, and glue. The soul of the work was knowledge, yes, but its body was fragile, and the body always came first. Visitors and rules. The door creaked open. A student from the madrasa, perhaps 16 years old, with ink-stained fingers and a nervous energy, shuffled in with a respectful nod. He requested Kitab al-Barhan by Aristotle, the Book of Demonstration. Abu Zaid handed it over with quiet ceremony. He had memorized the rules he himself had written years earlier, which hung by the door. Rules for the use of manuscripts. No inkpots near the texts. No writing inside the margins. No food or drink. No removal without inscription in the ledger. Mishandling may result in exclusion. Not one of these rules had been enforced with anger. Disappointment, however, was a far sharper deterrent. Still, accidents happened. Once, a student sneezed violently while reading a manuscript of Galen's medical treatises, and a page tore as he grasped it mid-sneeze. Abu Zaid had said nothing at the time, but spent an entire week silently reapplying paste to the inner spine. The student, so ashamed, never returned. The boy today, though, was careful. He moved like a man who understood the weight of what he held. The scholar's visit. Later that day, a more distinguished visitor arrived. Sheikh Bahram, a scholar from Ray who specialized in Persian translations of Greek philosophy. Bahram's voice was soft but layered with confidence. He requested to examine a copy of Al-Farabi's commentary on Aristotle's Organon. Abu Zaid retrieved the manuscript from a high shelf, delicately wrapped in wool to protect it from moths. For a time they stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, examining the illuminated marginal diagrams of syllogistic forms. Then Bahram frowned. "This copy is missing a leaf," he murmured. "Yes," Abu Zaid replied. "It was damaged in transit, likely water." "Do you have another version?" "Only in Syriac, poorly bound." "Still, I would like to see it." They retrieved it from a lesser shelf. The Syriac version had been written by a Nestorian scribe in the monastery at Maragha. The calligraphy was thinner, more angular, the ink paler, but it contained the missing diagram. Sheikh Bahram copied it painstakingly into his own folio with Abu Zaid watching, silently pleased. A small piece of lost knowledge, recovered through careful stewardship. And yet this small success reminded Abu Zaid of how much more remained at risk. The anatomy of decay. The structure itself, the physical library, was far from permanent. Each week, Abu Zaid took note of its weaknesses. A hairline crack creeping along the northern wall. A leak above the eastern niche, where scrolls of Persian poetry were stored. A slowly softening floor beam near the rear storage room. His ledger included not just records of books, but of wood, oil, nails, and labor. He tracked the age of the cedar shelves, noted how many replacement parchment sheets were in stock, and recorded when the last fumigation was done to deter silverfish. He wrote each note in the same calm handwriting, under the same ink-stained lantern light, with no fanfare. No one else would read these lines. Perhaps no one else would even care. But Abu Zaid did, because the failure to notice small things was the first step to losing everything. It was in the fragile details, a slightly too humid morning, a rusted lock, a broken hinge, that the memory of civilizations was most often lost. The legacy of lists. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, Abu Zaid opened a separate ledger not for work, but for reflection. In it he copied lines from books that moved him, quotes, odd thoughts, lists of names of deceased scholars whose works he had touched, preserved, or repaired. One page, written years earlier, simply read. A book survives because someone bothered to list it, bind it, dust it, and hide it from fire. That was his role, not to write great treatises or invent new ideas or win praise in courts. His role was to notice, to maintain the chain, to pass things forward. He thought of a single copy of an obscure Persian translation of Aristotle's categories, barely read, but preserved on a shelf that only he dusted. Who, he wondered, would carry it next? The economics of silence. By mid-afternoon, the last of the visitors had left. The light turned golden and began slanting low. Abu Zaid extinguished half the lanterns to save oil. The library, for all its grandeur in the eyes of outsiders, had a budget. It was supported by a Waqf endowment, but that money also fed madrasa teachers, paid for building repairs, and supplied paper to scribes. Each month he submitted expenditure reports to the administrator of the madrasa, stamped and signed, always neat. In truth, he understood the politics of such things. The more accurate and less costly his records, the more likely the library would continue to receive funding. And so he saved oil, repaired broken bindings himself when he could, bought parchment in bulk, bartering with a local seller whose son he helped with literacy. There was no glory in these acts, but there was continuity. The sunset ritual. As the sun dipped lower, Abu Zaid began the closing ritual. He extinguished the remaining lanterns, except for one near the doorway. He carefully folded dust cloths over the manuscripts left open, so they would not be disturbed overnight by insects or dry wind. Then he approached the door, stepped outside, and locked it with the brass key. Before turning to leave, he stood for a moment in the warm dusk, looking at the sandstone walls of the library. From the alley it looked like any other building, but inside it was a vault of memory, upheld not by grandeur but by small, silent habits. He turned and walked slowly home, ledger under one arm, the smell of dust and olive oil still clinging to his robe. Tomorrow he would do it again. But as he passed the outer courtyard, he saw something troubling, a small crack forming on the western wall near the roof beam. It wasn't large yet, but if ignored, it could widen with the next rain. He made a note in his mind, and later in the ledger. Wall fracture west face, notify carpenter next market day. And he thought, not for the first time, how many libraries were lost because someone failed to write something down. The stars emerged gradually over Nishapur, faint at first, then scattered in thick clusters across the firmament. The day's final call to prayer echoed softly from the mosque domes, while street vendors extinguished their torches and swept crumbs into the alleys. For most of the city, this marked the end of business and the beginning of rest. But for Abu Zaid, the librarian of the Bayid Court's manuscript house, the night was not yet over. The library was closed, yes, but his work continued long after the key turned in the lock. The memory of books, after all, did not rest with the sun. Evening notes. At his home, Abu Zaid unrolled a sheet of coarse paper and began copying his day's notes into the master inventory. This task was done each night, by lamplight, while sitting on a threadbare rug beneath an alcove of flickering light. He recorded: the return of Kitab al-Barhin, no new damage. The inquiry from Sheikh Barham. A minor crack in the western wall. Oil consumption, 4 jugs this week. One visitor requested a Syriac text and read silently for 2 hours. He did not embellish or editorialize. He simply documented. The ledger was not for posterity. No historian would read it centuries later. It was not bound in leather or stored in a place of honor. But it was, in a sense, the library's heartbeat, each note a pulse in the body of memory. A memory of ash. Abu Zaid had not always lived in Nishapur. As a younger man, he had spent 2 years in the eastern city of Merv. There, he had worked under a senior librarian, al-Harith, a towering man with a booming voice who spoke of books like one spoke of lost friends. He remembered the fire well. One dry spring, a cooking accident in the adjacent madrasa kitchen had turned into a blaze. The fire caught on the lacquered wood of the scroll shelves. Within minutes, hundreds of volumes were gone: medical treatises, Greek translations, Quranic commentaries, lists of stars, herbals from India, Persian epics, and tax records from the early Abbasid period. He still recalled the smell: burnt ink, glue, leather, and wet ash. He remembered standing among the rubble as al-Harith knelt to retrieve a single fragment of a charred manuscript. It was unreadable. The title had been reduced to smoke. That day, al-Harith said something Abu Zaid had never forgotten. People think fire destroys books, but books die every day quietly from indifference. That memory, more than any rule or prayer, shaped his life thereafter. A quiet legacy. Abu Zaid's own collection at home was modest. A few copied pages of al-Ghazali's ethical writings, a commentary on Ibn Sina's metaphysics, and some herbal notes written in his own hand. He bound them himself crudely, but with care. Sometimes he copied for the sake of preservation. Other times, simply to keep his hand steady. But most often, he copied because he feared no one else would. He knew the names of scribes long dead, whose handwriting he could recognize like a friend's voice. Men who had lived quiet lives, never leaving their city walls, but whose ink still lingered on brittle parchment. He had made it a personal mission to write down their names whenever he found them in marginalia. Copied by Yusuf ibn Fadl, 912 AH. Scribed by Khadija al-Qazwini in the month of Safar. Transcribed by an unknown hand in Basra, God forgive him his errors. Even Khadija, a rare female scribe, had vanished from memory, except for those 4 words in a margin. Abu Zayd underlined her name in his personal notebook and added a footnote, proof of presence. He believed these names were threads, and his job was to knot them together before they frayed. A visitor in the dark. That evening, as he prepared for rest, a quiet knock came at his door. It was Harun, the young bookbinder whose workshop smelled perpetually of vinegar, lye, and sheephide. Harun looked nervous, cradling a rolled parchment in cloth. "Master Abu Zayd," he whispered, "a caravan from Balkh arrived today. A merchant brought this. He said it was damaged. I thought perhaps you would want to see it first." Abu Zayd invited him in. Together they unwrapped the roll. Inside was a fragment of paper, stiff with age and dotted with wormholes. The ink was faded, but legible under the right angle of lamplight. It was a partial Quranic commentary, written in the distinctive hand of Ibn Tabari, a long-dead scholar of the eastern provinces. Abu Zayd recognized the script immediately. The dots above the letters were unusually high. The meme curled at the end like a Persian poem. How did he acquire this? He said it was used to wrap a shipment of dried figs. "A fig wrapper," Abu Zayd murmured, "for the words of God." He smiled, not in anger but in recognition. The fate of books, he knew, was often far more humble than their content deserved. Night in the library of dust. Abu Zayd slept lightly. Age and worry weighed on his dreams. Sometimes he dreamed of shelves collapsing. Other times of books speaking in whispers he could not decipher. One night he dreamed that a storm came, not of rain but of sand, and it filled every shelf, covered every manuscript, and when he opened the library door, all the words had been erased. But he would wake and write the dream down. In his nightstand was a scroll labeled Raya Visions, where he recorded his dreams related to books. Some were poetic, others mundane. One entry read, "Dreamed I found a scroll beneath the mosque fountain. It had no title, no text, just the name Marwan in the center. I do not know who Marwan is." But he wrote it down anyway, just in case. The final thought. In the years to come, the Buyid dynasty would decline. New rulers would come with different tastes, different scholars, different priorities. Abu Zayd would grow older. His hands would tremble. His ink would blot more easily. And one day perhaps the library would be shuttered, or repurposed, or forgotten entirely. But as long as he lived, he would unlock the door, sweep the mats, and light the lamps each day without fail. Because to him, each book was not just a vessel of knowledge. It was a person written by a hand that once lived, read by eyes now closed, and bound by thread that, like memory, was always at risk of fraying. And perhaps that is what made it most worth preserving. What stories have we lost not through conquest, not through fire, but simply because someone forgot to open the door? The year was 213 CE. And the frontier of the Roman Empire hummed not with conquest, but with routine. Along the Limes Germanicus, the fortified border separating Roman provinces from the untamed wilds of Germania, there stood hundreds of small watchtowers and outposts, each manned, maintained, and documented by a caste of mostly forgotten men. One of these men was Decimus Valerius Maximus, a duplicarius junior officer stationed at Tours Hadriani, a timber watchtower in the province of Germania Superior. Unlike the glamorous generals carved into marble or the senators quoted in scrolls, Decimus's life was filled with ledgers, firewood inventories, and ration logs. He did not seek glory, he sought order. And order on the frontier was measured not in battles but in pencil strokes on wax tablets, and in the rhythm of repetitive duties. The setting, Tours Hadriani. The watchtower was perched on a low hill, overlooking a clearing that sloped into dense pine and beech forest. On clear days, the Rhine was visible in the distance, a thread of silver in a tapestry of green. The structure itself was humble, a square platform raised on stone, topped with a wooden watch hut and surrounded by a palisade fence. The interior courtyard was just large enough for a few tents, fire pits, and a stable for messenger horses. 6 men were stationed there at a time, on a rotating schedule. At the heart of their work was not combat but documentation, and it was Decimus who maintained the records. A morning without drama. He rose just after sunrise to the sound of birdsong and the smell of damp pine. His woolen tunic, though coarse, had been brushed clean the night before. He fastened his leather belt, buckled on his boots, and stepped into the morning fog with a sigh. No alarm, no signals, no messengers. That was a good sign. His first duty was to inspect the fire beacons. If the Germans had attacked or if any unusual movement had occurred, the towers would have sent up plumes of black smoke. But the fire pits were cold, the signal pans untouched. A quiet night. He jotted this on a wax tablet using a stylus. Prima vigilia, no disturbances, beacon unlit. He scratched the wax cleanly, with the practiced hand of a man who had done it hundreds of times. Breakfast and bureaucracy. Rations were distributed just after inspection. Each soldier received 1 panis militaris, military bread, a ladle of pools barley porridge, a small chunk of salted pork, diluted pasca, vinegar wine. It was not a feast, but it sustained them. As Duplicarius, Decimus logged the distribution into the ration ledger, a wood-bound codex stored in the dry box under his cot. Each entry included the name, amount, and condition of supply. Servius, 1 panis, 0.25 pork. Pork showed signs of spoilage. Salt levels insufficient. Recommend alert to supply master at next rotation. There was no heroism in these notes, but if a supply chain broke down, men starved, morale dipped, deserters fled, rebellions brewed. The ledger, though dull, was the spine of the post. The ledger of duties. In the early hours, Decimus updated the tabula officiorum, the duty roster. Each man had a rotation. Watch on the tower platform. Gatekeeping. Cooking or cleaning duties. Scout patrols through the surrounding woods. Today, Marcus would take the tower post. Lucius was assigned latrine cleaning. Titus and Gaius would ride a short patrol north toward the mile marker stone. Decimus took care to rotate the men fairly. Favoritism bred dissent. Laziness infected the group. Even the most loyal legionnaire could turn bitter if assigned too many days of latrine duty. He carved the updates into a wooden tablet, which was displayed in the barracks tent for all to see. Later, he would transcribe it onto papyrus sheets sent monthly to the central outpost near Mogontiacum, modern-day Mainz. These were filed away in some cold archive that no soldier would ever see, but Decimus ensured each one was precise. Because if something went wrong, it would not be the senator in Rome who was blamed. It would be the man whose name was scrawled in bad handwriting. A patrol returns. Just before noon, the scout patrol returned. No bandits, no forest dwellers, just deer tracks and birdsong. Titus reported one noteworthy sighting: a group of local chatty tribesmen, 4 in number, crossing the ridge toward the river but not approaching the border. Likely hunters. Decimus recorded it carefully. 4 chatty observed from 400 paces. No weapons visible, no contact, direction west-northwest. He sketched a crude map in the corner of the record. No soldier enjoyed these notes, but Decimus knew that when the governor requested reports and there was no record of tribes moving, the entire post could be accused of negligence. He'd seen it before. In one instance, a neighboring post had failed to report movement, and a month later that region had been overrun. The commander was demoted. The ledger was burned. That would not happen here. Weather would and repairs. Next came the resource inspection. The tower's roof leaked. A section of fencing had loosened after last week's storm, and the firewood stack was dangerously low. Only 6 bundles remained. Each of these issues went into the maintenance log, with specific annotations. Fence repair required, southwest corner, nails corroded, estimated need, 12 nails, 2 men, 1 hour. Roof, small leak above central beam, drip rate, 3 drops per minute. He would submit these to the quartermaster on the next rotation day, along with estimates for brick, lime, and pitch. The precision of these notes may seem excessive to an outsider, but Decimus knew that unclear entries were a death sentence for logistical requests. If the quartermaster was confused, he would send nothing. And in winter, that meant death by exposure. The tedium of authority. Despite his humble rank, Decimus had authority over the daily mechanics of the post. Yet that authority rested not on charisma nor seniority, but on paperwork. He administered disciplinary notes, signed off on scouting logs, and compiled reports of animal sightings, important for tracking local movement. Each piece of data fed into a system far larger than him. The Roman Empire did not run on ambition alone. It ran on lists, routines, and clerks who recorded the days between battles. And yet, even in tedium, there was a kind of elegance. At midday, Decimus sat outside the barracks, polishing his wax tablets in the sun, melting the old writing to prepare for tomorrow's entries. He watched birds flit through the pine trees, then glanced at his list for the afternoon. Double-check grain store measurements. Inspect the saddle straps on the spare horses. Complete a full count of arrows in the armory. It would not be dramatic, it would not be remembered, but it would be done. Because if it was not, then when the next tribal incursion came, the men would be hungry, the saddles would break, and the arrows would run dry. And someone, somewhere, would ask for the name of the man responsible. Would they remember his careful notes? Would anyone? Is it the generals who win wars, or the men who make sure the firewood is dry? By early afternoon, the light had sharpened, casting long shadows across the uneven ground around Turs Hadriani. The watchtower, raised only a man's height above the treetops, stood as a lone sentinel of empire, neither remarkable in its construction nor impressive in its size. But like hundreds of other such posts scattered along the Limes Germanicus, it represented something larger, the illusion of permanence. For Decimus Valerius Maximus, the duplicarius and chief recordkeeper, permanence was always under threat not from war, but from forgetfulness. Counting arrows and measuring grain. After his noon meal, a reheated scoop of barley mash and a wedge of hard cheese, Decimus returned to the task list scratched into his morning wax tablet. First, the armory inventory. Each watchtower had a modest store of arms, rarely used in combat, but maintained by regulation. Decimus unlocked the supply chest and began a visual inspection. 22 arrows, 2 broken shafts. 5 javelins, 1 with split binding. 1 gladius pitted blade, rarely drawn. 6 helmets, 3 missing inner lining. He logged these on a wooden tally sheet, marking the damaged items with a red wax bead. At the next monthly delivery from Castra Novaesium, he would request replacements, knowing, of course, that such requests often went unanswered. The grain store was next. He took a bronze scoop and measured from the burlap sacks kept in the shaded storage pit. Mold was minimal, but weevils had begun to appear. Infestation minor. Estimate 4% loss. Recommend vinegar soaking and sifting. He logged the weight of each bag, the age of the supply, and the projected consumption rate for the next 3 weeks. If storms delayed the supply chain, they would need to ration salt and cut vinegar dilution further. Grain rot wasn't glamorous, but it was deadly. More legionaries died from spoiled rations than from arrows. The letter from Mogontiacum. That afternoon, a courier arrived from the garrison at Mogontiacum, bringing 2 sealed scrolls, one for the tower commander and one marked for Decimus personally. He opened his slowly, savoring the ritual. The seal was plain, no sign of rank, but the handwriting was official. Duplicarius Decimus Valerius Maximus. The legate's office requests monthly summary of chatty movement logs. Please include dated reports from the last 3 full moon cycles. Provide accuracy in toponyms and tribal identifications. Tribune Severus of the 22nd Legion. There was no praise, no signature flourish, just the expectation that somewhere a quiet man with ink-stained fingers had been keeping faithful record. Fortunately, Decimus had done just that. From his document chest, he withdrew a folded set of thin papyrus sheets, bound with a simple leather tie, one for each moon cycle, one for each sighting. He transcribed the requested sections neatly, added a crude map drawn with charcoal, then resealed them in a scroll tube for the returning courier. The courier never looked at the contents. He barely offered a grunt of thanks. But Decimus felt the small satisfaction of fulfilling a silent trust, that his obscure tower at the edge of nowhere was connected to something much larger. Boredom as a weapon. Soldiers often feared enemy raids, but Decimus knew the more persistent enemy was boredom. When there were no attacks, no tribal movement, and no disruptions, discipline frayed like an old sandal strap. Men drank too much, fought over dice, argued over latrine duty. To prevent this, Decimus developed a system of rotating microtasks: arrow counting, firewood chopping, saddle inspections, map sketching, even Latin dictation. He kept a small list of phrases, lines from Caesar, Cicero, and Tacitus that he'd transcribe each week into a disciplined scroll stored next to his logs. One entry read, "Order is the shadow of silence." Another, "No glory is found in a moldy cloak or empty satchel." The others didn't always appreciate these exercises, but over time, even the grumbling stopped. Routine gave them something to push against, and in doing so, reminded them they were still Roman. Nightfall conversations. That evening, as the fire pit crackled low, and the sky turned the color of old parchment, Decimus sat with Marcus, the youngest of the 6 station men. Marcus asked, not for the first time, "Do you ever think Rome forgets we're out here?" Decimus didn't answer right away. He watched a moth circle the flame, its shadow flickering on the canvas of the tent wall. "Rome is not a person," he said finally. "It does not remember and it does not forget, it just adds. Adds. Ledgers, reports, roads, names, like a scribe filling a scroll. But does anyone ever read the scroll?" Decimus gave a dry smile. "Probably not." They sat in silence. Somewhere in the trees an owl called. In the distance wolves howled, but the fence held. The fire burned low. The night routine began. The watch at midnight. Every tower kept a night watch schedule. Decimus took 3rd shift from midnight until the 2nd hour passed. He climbed the creaking ladder to the tower platform with his oil lamp, wrapped in thick wool to shield the wind. From here the forest looked vast and unknowable. There were no flames along the other towers, no smoke, no signals, just dark trees and darker thoughts. He recited the checklist in his mind. Wind direction, west to east. Visibility, 50 paces. Animal sounds, normal. Enemy movement, none. At 2 a.m. he descended. Back in his quarters, he etched the notes onto a clay rochely, designed to be hardened by fire later. Temporary records until the papyrus copies were made. As he lay down, body aching, thoughts scattered, he wondered. What if I stopped writing? What if the ledgers ended here? What would Rome do if it knew nothing more of Turs Hadriani? Does an empire end with war, or with a forgotten entry on a broken tablet? When the sun rose the next morning, it did so with indifference. Light spilled across the worn palisade and touched the dew-covered grass around the tower of Turs Hadriani. A new day began just like the previous one, measured not by the grand march of armies or thunderous proclamations, but by the monotony of paperwork. Decimus Valerius Maximus, duplicarius of the 22nd Legion, awoke at dawn and pulled on his boots with the mechanical precision of a man whose body followed the rhythm of regulation and repetition. His back ached. His fingers were stained with ink. His eyes blurred slightly as he lit the morning lamp and reviewed the tasks ahead. He scratched another date into his daily wax tablet. Die XVI Martius Anno Domini 213, calm. And then the scratching began again. An empire traced one stylus stroke at a time. A tower's purpose beyond war. Despite the myths that centuries would later construct about Roman frontiers, not every tower was built to repel invaders. Some were symbols meant to project order, to discourage disobedience, to remind the forests and fields that Rome was watching. The forest didn't care. Neither did the chatty hunters who passed silently across the border at night. They weren't raiders, not yet. They were foragers, survivors, shadows in the trees. Decimus documented them all the same. On this particular day, no patrols were scheduled. Instead, Decimus set about organizing the archive chest, a crude wooden box wrapped in oiled cloth to keep out moisture. Inside were 32 scrolls, 83 wax tablets, and several hardened clay rochely, each with notes etched in Latin abbreviations. RCS equals ration check stable. PA equals patrol absent. NI equals no incident. His system was efficient. Someday, he imagined, another officer would arrive and know immediately what had happened here, what hadn't happened, what still needed attention. But deep down, he knew the truth. No one was coming. Orders from above, silence below. A week later, a rider arrived bearing new orders. The legate had deemed Turs Hadriani to be unnecessary. A fortified post further east had been rebuilt and now covered the same region more effectively. The tower was to be decommissioned. The courier's instructions were simple. Burn unnecessary supplies, remove all arms, submit final inventory, dismiss personnel to Fort Vindonissa, ledger archives to be sent via rider to Mogontiacum. Decimus nodded and took the order with calm resignation. He had suspected as much. That afternoon, he gathered the others and relayed the news. There were no cheers, no arguments, just a quiet acknowledgement that their lives measured in watch rotations and firewood counts were being relocated. Marcus the youngest asked, "What about the tower?" "We leave it," Decimus said. "Strip it down, salvage what we can, let the forest take the rest." And that, as always, was the end of an outpost. Not conquest, not glory, but reassignment and forgetting. The final entry. On the last day, Decimus sat cross-legged outside the barracks, surrounded by stacks of tablets and scrolls. He sharpened his stylus and pressed into one final wax page, slow and deliberate. Final day, post dissolved by order of Tribune Severus. Inventory submitted, no unresolved incidents, all reports complete, no casualties, no violations. Entry by Decimus Valerius Maximus, witness to silence, guardian of stillness, recorder of days without war. He closed the tablet, wrapped it in wool, and placed it on top of the archive bundle to be sent to Mogontiacum. He did not linger. He did not carve his name into the wood. He simply rose, packed his belongings, and mounted his horse with the others. By the time the sun set, Turs Hadriani was quiet, its fire pits cold, its fences leaning into the wind. Within a year, the road to it would overgrow. Within 5, it would no longer appear on supply maps. Within 10, the locals would call it the ruined post, and children would play on the foundation stones, unaware that anyone had lived there at all. The dust of empires. Centuries later, archaeologists would dig at the limes Germanicus and find scraps, a broken amphora, a rusted helmet buckle, a clay rotulus with nearly illegible Latin scratches. They would puzzle over its meaning, assign it a catalog number, and perhaps mention the name Turs Hadriani in a dry journal footnote. But Decimus Valerius Maximus would be gone. Not in a blaze of glory or a scroll of honor, but dissolved into the bureaucracy he once held together. His handwriting, meticulous, silent, precise, would be read by no one. His tower would be a memory not even Rome remembered. And yet, was that not what made it important? Not the war that never came, but the peace that endured, one ledger entry at a time. If no one remembers the watchman, does the boarder remember being watched? The year was 106 BCE, and the Han dynasty stood in the heart of its imperial grandeur under the long reign of Emperor Wudi. While generals marched westward along the Silk Road and Confucian scholars debated virtue at court, a quieter force shaped the empire's pulse: salt. In the lowlands of Shandong, where shallow brine pools shimmered under a pale sun, a man named Liu Chen worked not as a scholar, soldier, or nobleman, but as a licensed salt merchant. He did not wear silk, he did not speak at court, he did not carry weapons. He carried a ledger, and in it, written in neat clerical script, were the weights, measurements, taxes, and distributions of a commodity so central to life that it was called Baijin white gold. Salt and the state. By Liu Chen's time, the Han government had long recognized salt's strategic value. Salt preserved meat, flavored rice, treated wounds, and even played a role in rituals and offerings. But it was also a financial engine. Emperor Wu had nationalized the salt trade just years earlier, appointing overseers, issuing merchant licenses, and demanding a share of all salt profits for the treasury. This helped fund his ambitious wars and cultural campaigns, but it also meant that salt merchants like Liu Chen now walked a narrow road between profit and prosecution. He was not an outlaw, he was something rarer, a state-sanctioned bookkeeper of brine. The routine of white crystals. Liu Chen lived in a modest house of packed earth and timber, adjacent to the brine pools near Linking, not far from the Grand Canal's precursor trade routes. He rose before sunrise, washed his hands in cold well water, and burned incense to the household gods. Then he unrolled his scrolls, thin strips of bamboo tied with silk thread. They were not poetry or philosophy, but numbers. Weight of yesterday's salt harvest. Volume of brine reduced. Number of hired laborers paid. Taxes owed to the local magistrate. Each strip had its own entry, and each entry had a date, name, and the seal of a government official, pressed in cinnabar ink. Salt did not move unless the numbers were correct. Boiling and balance. The salt was harvested through brine evaporation, a process as dull as it was essential. Liu Chen supervised workers, often local peasants or traveling laborers who stoked kilns beneath large ceramic pans. Brine was poured in. Firewood burned hot. Over hours, water boiled away, leaving behind fine white crystals. The work was harsh. Smoke choked the air and salt burned the skin. Liu Chen monitored it all with quiet detachment, noting which batches were overcooked, which were underweight, and which needed to be discarded. He recorded everything. Batch 467, 38 gin salt. 6 gin lost to wind. Fuel, 4 bundles pine wood. Firemaster, Yu Fong. Assistant, Lai. Observed from 3rd hour to 6th hour. Nothing glamorous, nothing memorable, but without these notes the shipment could be confiscated as illicit. The state required proof of origin, method, and labor. The Bureau of Salt and Iron. Once a month, Liu Chen visited the local salt bureau, a small administrative building near the district magistrate's hall. It was here he submitted his scrolls, paid dues, and received permission slips for outbound shipments. The officials wore long gray robes and thin mustaches. Their eyes scanned his scrolls with practiced disinterest. One dipped his brush in ink and stamped them without comment. But a missed line, a skipped batch number, a discrepancy in weight could bring disaster. Fines, confiscation, or worse, the revocation of license. Liu Chen once witnessed a fellow merchant Guo Heng dragged from the office over a shortfall in tax grain. No trial, no appeal. His salt shed burned, his name struck from the rolls. Liu Chen recorded the incident in his private scroll, not out of sentiment, but caution. Guo Heng dismissed for 14 gin discrepancy, suspected smuggling, records seized, license cancelled. Salt may have been dry, but the bureaucracy was wet with fear. Marriage, money, and modesty. Liu Chen lived alone. His wife had died 3 winters earlier and he had no children. His apprentice, a teen named Bo, helped with counting loads and stacking bamboo strips. Bo once asked him why he never remarried. Liu Chen had replied, "A wife asks why you count coins all night. A ledger never questions." He didn't mean it cruelly. Only that order brought peace, and marriage brought variables: love, loss, noise. His home reflected his mind. Neat bundles of scrolls, stacks of kiln logs, a single sleeping mat, and a wall of painted numerals. Even his tea was measured. Risk on the roads. When a shipment was ready, Liu Chen oversaw the weighing and sealing. The salt was packed into coarse hemp sacks, tied shut with red string, and loaded onto ox carts headed for the southern market towns. Each cart carried a travel permit, a bamboo slip tied to the axle, inscribed with the merchant's name, the batch number, and the official seal. The guards at road checkpoints would inspect it and match it to the district records. Bo asked once, "What happens if the string breaks, if the seal is smudged?" Liu Chen didn't answer right away. "Then they assume theft," he said, "and no one believes a merchant when the salt is already gone." Which is why he copied 2 versions of every document, one for the bureau, and one hidden under his mat. The ethics of grain and salt. In the evening, Liu Chen sometimes unrolled old Confucian texts not to study, but to remind himself why the state watched men like him. One line stayed with him: "When profit governs men, chaos follows." But what of a man whose profit served the state, who fed soldiers, preserved grain, and stabilized markets? He did not see himself as greedy, only necessary. He had once donated 10 gin of salt to a nearby village during a flood and been fined for lack of proper documentation. He made no protest. He added a note to his ledger: "Loss of 10 gin for kindness, offset by silence." The whisper of salt in wind. At night, Liu Chen lay on his mat and listened to the wind rattle the eaves. The kilns would still glow in the dark. Bo slept by the door, snoring faintly. Outside, the brine pools glistened under the moonlight, and within them shimmered not just salt, but taxes, control, survival, and silence. He reached for his smallest scroll, the private one, and wrote, "Salt forgets the hands that make it, so I write so someone might remember." Then he blew out the lamp. What happens to a country that loses the taste of its own sweat? By the 12th day of the 3rd month, the wind off the brine pools had shifted. Warmer now, more humid. The early signs of the wet season began to settle across Linking. the quiet lowland town where Liu Chen lived and worked as a licensed salt merchant under the Han Dynasty's expanding bureaucracy. The boiling pans were still hot by dawn, and the scent of firewood, wet clay, and mineral air hung in the stillness like incense. From a distance, the pools glimmered placid and dull, as if nothing of importance ever happened there. But salt had its own shadows, and in Liu Chen's ledger, things were beginning not to add up. A subtle discrepancy. It started small. While reviewing the weight reports for batch 472, Liu Chen noticed a mismatch. His assistant, Bo, had recorded a weight of 38 jin, while Liu's own notes taken only 2 days prior listed 40.25 jin before drying loss. 2 jin might seem insignificant, a pinch of salt to the average man, but to the state it meant lost revenue, an accusation of misreporting or worse, smuggling. Liu Chen called Bo into the small storeroom, where they kept the bamboo scrolls and fire tally beads. "Are you sure of this entry?" "Yes, Master Liu. I weighed the sacks twice." "Then where are the missing 2 jin?" Bo paled slightly, perhaps the wind or evaporation. Liu Chen nodded, but made a note in his private scroll. Discrepancy, batch 472, no visible loss. Monitor assistant's logs for precision. He did not accuse, he did not raise his voice, but he began to watch. Because if he had learned anything from years of balancing brine and bureaucracy, it was this. Salt goes missing quietly, so do men. An unexpected visitor. 3 days later, just after the midday fire was stoked, a government inspector arrived unannounced. Dressed in a stiff hemp robe dyed the bureaucratic gray of the Ministry of Works, he carried a leather-bound pouch and a travel-stained ledger scroll. His name was Cheng Ren, and he spoke not like a man, but like a law etched into stone. "Merchant Liu, you are summoned for random inspection. Present licenses, permits, tax tallies, and logs for the last 20 batches." Liu Chen bowed silently and complied. For the next hour, Cheng Ren sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through bamboo slips with dry fingers. He asked no questions, made no remarks, offered no judgments. But he paused at batch 472. "Harvest date 2nd day of 3rd month." "Yes." "Weight discrepancy. You marked 40.25, assistant marked 38. Liu Chen replied calmly. "The final salt weight can vary with humidity, wood heat, or errors in drying." Cheng Ren looked at him for a long moment, then said nothing. He made a mark beside the entry and continued. "The economics of fear." After Cheng Ren left, Liu Chen felt the silence deepen not in the air, but in the men. Bo stopped humming during his morning chores. The laborers spoke in hushed tones. Even the kiln master, Yu Fang, stirred his salt pans with extra care. A state inspection, especially unscheduled, sent ripples through the salt world. Though legal, Liu Chen knew that a second visit within the same season might suggest suspected irregularities. The state did not accuse hastily, it simply tightened its grip. So Liu Chen adjusted. He double-checked every recorded weight. He assigned Bo only to transport duties, not measurements. He began sealing his ledgers at night, with wax pressed from an old family chop. And in his personal scroll he wrote, "2 jin once forgotten, now echo louder than 20 honest years." A question of loyalty. Bo eventually asked the question Liu had been waiting for. "Master Liu, do you think they suspect you?" Liu Chen poured tea, letting the silence stretch like steam. "They suspect everyone. That is the safety of the system." "But you've done nothing wrong." Liu looked down at his cup, the leaves swirling in mild patterns. "That won't matter if the next inspector cannot understand my handwriting." Bo blinked, "But your script is perfect." Liu Chen allowed himself the smallest smile. "To us, yes. To a tired official with quotas, who can say?" That night, he rewrote 3 entries from older batches, just to be safe, making sure the characters were bold, the numbers clear, the seal marks freshly inked. He knew of merchants whose entire careers had ended because a clerk misread a digit. The fine line between profit and crime. As Emperor Wu's military campaigns expanded westward, the state's need for revenue had grown insatiable. Salt, along with iron, became its financial backbone. Merchants like Liu Chen walked a razor's edge, allowed to profit but never to prosper too much. If one had too many carts, too many laborers, too clean a robe, suspicion followed. The state did not allow for visible wealth outside its sanctioned nobility. So Liu Chen remained modest. No silk, only cotton. No horse, only cart. No painted home gate, only unvarnished wood. And never ever more than 3 sacks of salt in personal storage. Everything else was documented, taxed, and justified. A whisper from the north. News came from Jinan, a salt town 2 days north. A merchant there had been arrested. No one knew why. His ledgers were reportedly in order, his kiln logs up to date. But someone had reported him anonymously. Bo asked, "What if someone does that to us?" Liu Chen replied, "Then we thank them for their honesty and provide better records." Bo frowned, "That's all." Liu Chen nodded, "That's all we can do." And in his private scroll he added, "Fear is the 4th ingredient in salt. The others are water, labor, and time." An unresolved entry. As the month drew to a close, Liu Chen reviewed the newest batches. One stood out. Batch 481, weight unclear, storm interrupted drying, sacks partially wet. He wasn't sure what to record. The salt wasn't spoiled, but its weight would be inconsistent. If he marked it too low, the bureau might accuse him of concealment. Too high, and it might look like inflation. He stared at the bamboo slip for a long time, brush in hand. Then slowly he wrote, Batch 481, weight uncertain, verified twice. Rain damage possible, recommend bureau inspection. He affixed his personal seal next to the entry. It was a deliberate risk, but perhaps better than another 2 jin unaccounted for. Still, that night, sleep did not come easily. He lay awake wondering, if the state cannot trust its most careful servants, what remains of its own record-keeping? The rains came hard during the final days of the month. Sheets of water fell from a sky the color of old stone, turning the flatlands of Linking into fields of shimmering mud and swollen runoff. For the salt workers, it was a disaster. For Liu Chen, it was a bureaucratic catastrophe. Evaporation ceased. The brine pans flooded. Kilns stood cold under protective tarps, and every day without production was another blank space in the ledger, a terrifying absence in a world where presence meant proof. To the state, it might look like inactivity. To the inspector, it might suggest concealment. And to Liu Chen, it simply meant more pages to explain. Writing the absence. Liu Chen sat in his workroom, surrounded by damp bamboo slips, writing with methodical precision. No salt produced. 5th 9th day of continuous rain. No labor losses. All tools stored. Kilns covered. Fuel reserves intact. He repeated the entry across 5 consecutive strips, each marked with the official date, the lunar cycle, and his personal seal. Bo, standing nearby, finally asked, "Why write the same thing 5 times?" Liu Chen didn't look up. Because the only thing more dangerous than a lie in the ledger is a silence. Rumors in the mud. Word reached Liu Chen that 2 more merchants from nearby Deju had been arrested. Their kilns had continued firing during the rain, violating regulations on fuel waste. "They say the inspectors are looking for examples now," one laborer whispered. "Scapegoats," said another. The mood around the brine pools shifted. Workers became hesitant. Some left. Others demanded pay up front. Bo stopped speaking unless spoken to. The firemaster, Yu Feng, began checking his logs twice before handing them to Liu. Liu responded not with reassurance but with structure. He drafted an emergency report citing rain disruption. Added a full list of stored inventory, down to the last sack. Prepared a sealed pouch of backup scrolls, should the Bureau request inspection. He even copied his own entries twice, a redundancy that seemed paranoid to Bo, but Liu Chen had learned through loss that backup was not precaution, it was protection. A fire in the kiln house. Then, on the 11th night of the rains, the kiln house caught fire. The storm had begun to ease when a lightning strike, rare but not unheard of, hit the edge of the drying shed. The roof, made of oiled straw and patched timber, ignited instantly. Rain slowed the spread, but not before several bundles of scrolls and sacks of salt were lost. Liu Chen was woken by Bo's shouts and ran barefoot through the mud to help douse the flames. By dawn, the fire was out. The damage was significant. 7 sacks of salt destroyed. 2 bamboo scroll bundles burnt. Roof beams weakened by heat. Liu said nothing for an hour. Then he sat beneath a cracked lintel and began writing. The emergency report. He composed a formal incident record, not in his usual calm script, but with tense, deliberate strokes. On the 11th night of the 3rd month, during heavy rain, lightning struck the kiln house. Resulting fire destroyed materials and records. Eyewitness, Apprentice Bo. Fire contained within the 2nd hour. Loss of product, 7 sacks. Loss of record, 2 bundles. Request Bureau acknowledgement and tax adjustment. He stamped the document. Then, perhaps for the first time in a decade, he took out his family seal, inherited from his father, a seal he had never used professionally. He pressed it into the corner of the scroll. Not for status, but for authenticity. Then he sent the scroll by fast rider to the regional bureau. Aftermath and account. The following days were quiet. The sky cleared. The kilns were repaired. New pans were installed. Bo salvaged what he could of the charred scrolls. One record barely legible was of batch 478, a routine harvest but now blackened at the edges. Liu Chen added it to the damaged but partial folder, a bundle he kept separate, hoping no official would ask for it. A month passed, then a reply came from the Bureau. Loss noted, inspection deferred, continue operations, submit adjusted scrolls with next tax payment, no penalty at this time. There was no apology, no comfort, no acknowledgement of danger or exhaustion. Just continue. Liu Chen read the message, folded it slowly, and stared at the brine pools, now reflecting a cloudless sky. What was saved? He had rebuilt his ledgers. He had recovered what he could. But he also knew some records were lost forever. Some entries would never be copied again. Some measurements, some labors would drift into the invisible margins of history. And yet the salt still formed. The kiln still glowed. Bo, quieter now but more precise, had begun taking measurements before being asked. And in the corner of Liu Chen's private scroll, he wrote, "Salt forgets but the ledger does not. Fire consumes but ink lingers in memory." Then he paused. He added one final line. "If these scrolls survive, let the reader know we did not chase wealth. We weighed silence and taxed it." The quiet end of a cycle. Liu Chen would continue working for another 6 years. Then, one spring, the Bureau would cancel his license not for misconduct, but as part of a regional reform meant to consolidate control under a new governor. He would not protest. He would retire to a smaller village north of the canal, where he would continue writing scrolls, even when no one asked for them. They were never found, except for one fragment, recovered from a storage jar during a 20th century excavation. Salt is not the treasure. The record of salt is the treasure. Signed Liu Chen, son of quiet days. If salt preserved meat, who preserved the man who made it? The year was 892 CE, and the Viking trading town of Hedeby stirred awake under a pale northern sun. Built along a natural inlet near what is now modern-day Schleswig, Germany, Hedeby was no remote village of warlike outlaws. It was a place of commerce, craft, and carefully maintained order. Ships came and went carrying furs, iron, amber, glass beads, and slaves. Merchants haggled in Norse, Old Saxon, and Slavic tongues. Monks from Frankish lands skulked through, taking notes. And somewhere between the smoky forges and the fish markets, a man named Kettle Arnfastson kept his head down and counted wheels. He was not a raider, he did not own a sword. He was a wheelwright. And his world turned not on plunder, but on the preservation of movement axles, cart hubs, iron bands, and wood grain. The quiet shop beside the road. Kettle's workshop was little more than a lintel pressed against a longhouse wall, its eaves covered in soot-blackened moss and its floor layered with sawdust. Inside hung the smells of pine tar, aged timber, linseed oil, and horse sweat. On a small wooden shelf sat his most valuable possession, a wax tablet ledger wrapped in oiled leather, tied shut with knotted twine. Inside it were the mundane details of an often overlooked world. Cart wheel replacements for traveling merchants. Repair notes on axles damaged by frost. Charges for adding iron rims. Names of repeat clients and the weeks they were due back. Kettle, broad-shouldered and quiet-spoken, was a man of few words. He left speech to the merchants and the monks. His power lay in his measurements. A day in the life of a Viking wheelwright. He rose before dawn to check the drying racks, where split beech and ash would season slowly over months. Wood that was too wet would warp, too dry and it would crack. After inspecting the moisture content by touch, smell, and ear, he set aside 5 spokes for a client due at noon. Then came the repair queue. He reviewed his ledger. Week of the new moon, Jarl Sigurd cart for ox team. Front left hub split, requires new dowel pegs. Thorskud's son's 2-spoke replacements, water damage likely, note iron missing. He selected tools from his wall pegs. A dowel chisel, a curved knife, a rasp made from a reshaped sword blade, and a bucket of still-warm pitch for waterproofing. His workbench bore deep scars, each one a silent testament to hundreds of carts that had passed through. Movement means trade. In Hedeby, carts were lifeblood. While longships captured the imagination, it was the wagons loaded with goods and creaking through forest trails that fed the town. Amber from the Baltic, whetstones from Gotland, linen from Frisia, salt from the south. Every one of these passed at some point over Kettle's wheels. He kept records not for pride but necessity. Without them he wouldn't know. Which wheels were under seasonal warranty. Which traders bartered instead of paid. Which parts had been reused and might fail sooner. Which customers were likely to haggle or lie. One ledger entry read: Spring Otter the Thin, bartered 3 silver beads for wheel patch, agreed to return with iron band, did not return, mark unreliable. The math of the ordinary. His ledger had a second section, material stock. Beechwood 16 spoke lengths. Ash 12 rims. Elm 3 half-rounds low quality. Iron bands, 7 all repurposed from broken cart wheels. Pitch 1 jar remaining. Horsehair rope 2 spools. He counted this stock every 8th day, logging the measurements by eye and hand. He knew the exact length a rim must bend before cracking, the moment a chisel should be resharpened, how many turns of twine it took to fasten a hub before it loosened in rain. To outsiders, it was peasant work. To Kettle, it was the maintenance of the world. Between raids and roads, visitors sometimes asked him why he didn't join the raids. After all, he was strong, quiet, and good with tools. He once answered, A man who raids might fill a chest. A man who repairs builds a path. No one asked him again. Instead, they brought him broken wheels and silence. He preferred it that way. The language of squeaks and splinters. One spring day, a foreign merchant from the Carolingian frontier came with a squealing cart. Kettle examined it wordlessly, lifting the axle, spinning the wheel, listening. The man tried to explain in garbled Norse that it squeaked near water. Kettle nodded once and pointed to the iron rim, warped slightly from repeated freezing. He opened his ledger, found a similar case from last winter. Wagon 13 South Road, winter thaw, rim slipped. Solution, bore 2 extra holes and lash with cord soaked in pitch. He applied the same fix. The merchant left satisfied. Kettle added a new note. Spring 892, Carolingian trader, south axle, repeat of 13. Confirm rim slippage common in southern carts. Advise check in all future foreign wheels. Even failures became future repairs. Debt and documentation. Not all clients paid on time. One man halved in bare tooth owed Kettle 3 months' wages for an elaborate 2-cart job. When Havden claimed he would return next week with coin, Kettle quietly opened his ledger and pointed to 3 previous entries marked. Havden paid partial. Havden owed 1 iron ring. Havden no return. The man blushed, paid half and left in a hurry. Later Kettle added, paid 50%, acceptable, no trust in future large repairs. He never raised his voice, but the ledger remembered when people didn't. A day's end in the workshop. As the sun dipped low over Hedeby, carts returned to the gates, fishmongers haggled over unsold stock, and the forge clanged somewhere in the distance. Kettle brushed sawdust from his knees, rolled up his sleeves, and dipped a sharpened reed into a small pot of ink. On a square of parchment gifted by a passing monk, he began transcribing a copy of his ledger for safekeeping. He wrote in runes sparingly, with straight lines and few curves. Space was precious. The last line of the day read, no war came today, but 5 carts did. 1 wheel broke, 4 continued. Is the road remembered for who walked it, or for who kept it smooth? The winds off the fjord had turned sharper by the 10th week of spring, and in the Viking trading town of Hedeby, that meant rain-slick carts, swollen trails, and broken axles. For Kettle Arnfastson, the town's primary wheelwright, it meant business. Not frantic, not dramatic, but steady, a rhythm of knocks on wood, measurements repeated 1,000 times, and ledger marks that quietly told the story of a world in motion. While ships still ruled the fjords, trade by road remained vital, especially in spring, when rivers surged and longships waited for calmer waters. And behind every laden wagon that passed through Hedeby's southern gate, Kettle could see not a merchant, not a warrior, but a future repair. Reading the wood. That morning, Kettle received a delivery from Ulf the carpenter, several fresh rounds of ashwood, and 1 particularly twisted piece of elm, likely felled from a bent tree. He inspected each with the same ritual. He knocked on the surface and listened for hollowness. He smelled the end grain for signs of rot. He scraped a small line along the grain and studied the curl of the shaving. Then, in his material ledger, he recorded, Ulf 5 ash, 1 elm, elm twisted set aside for wedgework only. He made a second mark, a small diagonal slash, his own visual code for usable but unstable. No apprentice would see this, no client would care. But Kettle knew the difference between a round that would last through spring and one that would crack after 2 market runs. An aging cart and a traveler's patience. A trader from the Baltic coast, a man named Sven Skaldson, arrived with a 3-wheeled cart, one side dragging low and creaking like an old man's knees. Kettle examined it without speaking, rolling the wheel gently on the packed dirt floor. 4th spoke snapped, he said, Probably from ruts, your axle's bowed too. Sven nodded grimly. Can you patch it before the south caravan leaves? Kettle checked his ledger. The wheel type matched a model he'd serviced 2 winters ago, a Lithuanian-style cart, lighter in frame but prone to stress fractures in colder soil. He flipped to a prior entry. Cart 22, same make, spring thaw, spokes snap under shallow loads, repair with triple wedge. He nodded once. I'll reinforce it, but it won't like wet roads. Sven paid in iron nails 8, newly forged. Kettle marked the transaction. Sven scouts in nails barter, 4 for repair, 4 held as credit. He placed the extra 4 in a pouch marked, clients to return. Small trust carefully measured. The hidden craft. To most of Hedeby, Kettle was a craftsman of things seen. Wheels, hubs, pegs, rims. But his true talent lay in what was hidden. The precise angle of a spoke bore, invisible once installed. The grain alignment of a split rim, so it flexed instead of fractured. The iron nails reused from shipwrecks, which held slightly better than merchant-grade stock. He once explained it to Bo, a curious boy from across the inlet who occasionally watched him work. The wheel is made of 12 truths, you only see 4, the rest you ride on. Bo didn't understand, but he nodded. Borrowed work in quiet theft. One afternoon, Kettle noticed a familiar cart outside the tannery, a 2-wheel dray he'd built last autumn. But something was wrong. The hubcaps bore a different seal. He approached it quietly and ran his finger along the inner rim. He found his own mark, 3 lines crossed, pressed into the wood before sealing. But the rest had been planed off, erased and rebranded. Later that night, he checked his ledger. Dray cart autumn for Hacken the tanner, paid partial, promised return in 1 moon, did not. No one had asked him to repair it, someone else had. He added a new note. Cart resurfaced, work stolen, let it ride poorly. There would be no confrontation, just a quiet withdrawal of warranty. He would never service that cart again. Taxmen and tallies. As Hedeby grew wealthier, the kings of Denmark and their agents began taking greater notice. One such man, a Saxon-speaking clerk from the court of King Guthrum, arrived that spring, walking the streets with a stylus and a wax tablet. He wasn't a warrior, he was a recorder, and he asked one question repeatedly. How many wheels pass through your shop in a month? Kettle, arms folded, gave the answer without hesitation. Between 30 and 40. The man raised an eyebrow. You count. Kettle said nothing. Instead, he handed him a sheet of scraped birch bark, his monthly tally. Each entry listed. Cart owner. Date of service. Type of repair. Payment method, coin, goods, or credit. The taxman frowned, uncertain what to do with such precision. He made a few notes, nodded, and left. Later, Kettle added to his ledger. Tax inquiry record accepted. Keep double copy next month. In a time when many traders hid earnings, Kettle protected himself with clarity. His records were not just for tracking wheels. They were shields. Wheels that never came back. Kettle had another ledger. It was smaller, older, and tied with black twine. It contained the names of wheels that left and never returned. The ox cart from the south that cracked near Dorstead. The funeral dray carrying a sick boy to Jelling. A grain wagon that vanished in the woods north of Heathabu. He didn't write much, just a name, a date, and a small note. Not seen again. Burned near the forest, likely thieves. Wheel failed or road failed. Bo once saw the list and asked why he kept it. Because the road forgets, Kettle said, but I shouldn't. A crack in the pattern. That evening, Kettle heard a new sound, a crack, soft but unmistakable from his own cart. He'd ignored a loose spoke for a week, prioritizing client work. Now it had split fully. He stood there in the dusk, listening to the wind rattle his workshop door and smiled ruefully. Even the wheelwright must be reminded. He marked it in the ledger. Personal cart, rear right spoke, left too long, shameful. Then beneath it he wrote, repair tomorrow with care. If a wheel fails and no one records it, was it ever well made to begin with? The summer solstice passed with little fanfare in Hedeby. No grand feast marked it. No procession of boats lit the harbor. The air hung thick with flies and smoke from distant forges, and the trading town carried on bartering, sweating, mending, moving. For Kettle Arnfastson, wheelwright and keeper of quiet commerce, the heat changed little in his workshop. Wood still cracked in the sun. Iron still expanded on the rim. The ledgers still needed updating, and customers still came with splinters in their palms and wheels trailing like broken limbs. But something in the rhythm was shifting. A season, once firm under his hands, was softening. And Kettle, though he said nothing aloud, had begun preparing for his final repairs. The ledger grows heavier. His wax tablet, once scratched hastily in short bursts, now took longer to fill. He had begun rechecking his own handwriting. His eyes blurred in the late light, forcing him to write before the second bell. The ledger still held shape, but he felt the weight of it in his fingers now. He began indexing older entries, cross-referencing wheel types with failure rates, listing customers by trustworthiness, highlighting frequent barterers, especially those who never returned. One afternoon, Bo found him hunched in the back, carving new runes into a birch panel. Axle width by cart type merchant, farmer, traveler. Spoke count by weight class. Rim material comparison, ship iron versus cart iron. Bo watched, puzzled. Why are you carving what you already know? Kettle didn't pause. Because I won't always be here to remember it. A long-term customer says goodbye. Sven Skaldson, the Baltic trader from earlier in the year, returned one last time. His cart was newer, better built, and Kettle saw his own handiwork it held. I'm heading east, Sven said. Going past Ladoga, might not come back this time. He paid in good silver more than was required. When Kettle tried to refuse the excess, Sven gripped his shoulder. Your wheels held me up over 1,000 muddy paths. That's worth more than a few iron nails. Kettle nodded, added the payment to the ledger, and quietly scratched a single star next to Sven's name. A mark reserved for only 5 others over the years. After Sven left, he sat alone for a while and wrote, Cart 489, final check, no repair needed, first time in 3 summers, let it roll. A broken apprentice. One evening, Bo dropped a rim. The ash would split cleanly on the shop floor, cracking through 2 weeks of careful bending. Bo looked horrified. I measured it 4 times. The tree didn't, Kettle said. They cleaned the splinters in silence. Later that night, Kettle handed Bo a scroll. You've been watching, now you'll write. It was a copy of the ledger template, the same structure he'd used for 20 years. Client name, date, repair type, materials used, notes and observations, payment or lack thereof. Begin tomorrow, you'll track 5 carts, not for tax, for truth. Bo hesitated, I'm not ready. Kettle smiled. Neither was I. The final cart. On the 8th day of high summer, a farmer came in with a wheel beyond repair. The spokes warped, the hub cracked, the rim rusted. He asked if Kettle could patch it. Kettle examined the piece, then gently shook his head. You need a new wheel. I don't have silver. Then pay with honesty. The farmer blinked. What does that mean? Tell others when it fails. Say where you wrote it. Say who built it. The farmer agreed, and Kettle set to work. It was his last full wheel build. He shaped each spoke with deliberate care, choosing the best ash from his remaining stock. The rim was iron from a broken anchor he'd been saving. He tapped each dowel into place with slow, firm strikes. When it was done, he pressed his 3-line mark into the inside of the hub, deeper than usual. Then he recorded. Cart 502, full build, paid in trust, let it be known. The closed ledger. That night Kettle sharpened his stylus, cleaned his workshop, and placed the main ledger now full into a sealed oilskin pouch. He placed it beneath a floorboard, alongside tools too worn for further work. He kept only the index board, the template, and his private scroll. On it he wrote a final line. No more wheels, the road rolls without me. What remains? Bo would eventually take over the workshop. His hand was less steady, but his eyes were sharp. He copied the template. He added new notations. He even improved the spoke weight system. But he kept Kettle's final wheel on display, unused next to the door. Travelers would ask about it, and Bo would simply say, "That one's perfect. I'm not yet ready to make another like it." As for the ledgers, some were lost in later floods. Some were sold for parchment scraps, but one survived a damp, brittle volume discovered in the ruins of Hedeby centuries later. Inside, the ink barely visible, one entry reads, "No war today, but 5 carts did come. 1 broke, 4 continued." What holds a world together? The warriors who charge, or the hands that quietly keep the wheels turning? The year was 801 CE, and the early morning frost still clung to the stones of Abbey St. Martin, tucked in the rolling green fields of the Carolingian Empire, a monastic stronghold of both silence and scribes. Charlemagne had just been crowned Imperator Romanorum the year before, while the emperor consolidated power in Aachen and dreamed of a new Christian empire, far from the politics and courts. A quiet man rose before dawn in a stone cell with a single task: copy the word, preserve the light, hold the line against forgetting. His name was Brother Alcuin of Tours, not to be confused with the famed scholar of the same name at court. This Alcuin was no theologian of note. He had no correspondence with royalty, no students who would quote him. His role was simpler yet essential. He was a scribe in the monastery's scriptorium, a man whose life revolved around quills, ink, margins, silence, and the endless repetition of other men's words. Morning, the bell and the first light. Brother Alcuin woke before sunrise, as he had done every day for over 20 winters. His knees ached from the cold. His fingers, stiff with ink callus, were already curved in sleep. He wore the same woolen robe, coarse and unwashed, its cuffs stiff from years of being dipped accidentally or otherwise into ink and glue. The first bell, rung by the novice at the tower's north side, signaled lauds, the morning prayer. He moved through the cloister silently, lips moving in rhythm with the psalms. But unlike others, whose days would be filled with chores or study or tending the garden, Brother Alcuin returned after lauds not to rest or reflection, but to the scriptorium. The scriptorium itself. It was not a grand space. A long room lined with narrow desks, oil lamps set in stone brackets, small windows placed high and awkwardly intended to let in light, but not enough warmth to soften the winter air. Each scribe had a wax tablet for drafting words or practicing initials, a reed or goose quill trimmed daily with a small knife, a scraper for erasing mistakes from vellum, a penner holding gall ink brewed from iron salts and oak galls, and most importantly, the original manuscript from which they copied. Alcuin's station was near the end, far from the window, where the light was poorer, but the distractions fewer. The work begins. He opened the day's task. A half-completed folio of Gregory the Great's pastoral care, written in Carolingian minuscule, the recently standardized script promoted by imperial reformers to unify writing across the Christian world. He dipped his quill, he breathed slowly. Then, incipit liber pastoralis curi. Letter by letter. line by line, careful not to crowd the margins, careful to keep the spacing uniform, careful to not let thought outrun form. Mistakes were not punished, but they were remembered. Every blot of ink, every uneven curve, remained locked in the vellum, forever a quiet reminder that even sacred labor had blemishes. The rhythm of quiet labor. The scriptorium was silent. Conversation was forbidden, except for the occasional whispered request for penna, pen, or tabula, tablet. The scratching of quills echoed like tiny rain over stone. The occasional cough or the crackle of the fire punctuated the rhythm. Every hour the bell would ring. At terse third hour after dawn, the scribes would pause, kneel, and return. Then again at sext, the midday prayer. Brother Alcuin rarely looked up. He copied for 6 hours straight, stopping only to sharpen his quill or sip lukewarm broth brought by a young novice. He recorded each break in the margin of his wax tablet not for himself, but to track ink consistency and page yield. One entry read, Sexta hora, ink began to blot, adjust gall content tomorrow. No one told him to do this. He simply understood. The survival of the word depended on knowing why it smudged. Materials, mistakes, and marginalia. Each day, Alcuin worked with vellum-stretched calfskin that curled at the corners and smelled faintly of its past life. He inspected each page for imperfections, holes, stretched lines, uneven pores. These affected ink absorption. A misjudged page could waste a full day's labor. His ink was made in the monastery's own scriptorium workshop, from oak galls collected in late summer, iron sulfate purchased from itinerant traders, water and wine sediment, a drop of gum arabic for binding. He wrote about these things in the back of his personal booklet. Ink batch 4 too acidic, paper scored. Batch 5 holds well in damp. Gall collection weak this year, might need to mix with elder bark. To most, these were trivialities, but to Brother Alcuin, they were the scaffolding of God's message. Even monks of higher status, those tasked with interpretation and preaching, forgot that their wisdom rested on the clarity of the lines he drew. Visitors from the outside. Occasionally, an imperial envoy or scholar would visit from Aachen or another abbey, inspecting the progress of the copying work. They rarely spoke to Alcuin. They spoke to the abbot, asking about the number of volumes produced, the style of script, the speed of copying. But once, one such envoy, a young deacon named Adelmo, paused near Alcuin's desk and said, "You've copied 20 folios of Gregory. Do you not tire of the same words?" Alcuin looked up for the first time that day. "I do not read them, I remember them, one letter at a time." The mistake that stayed. Late in the day, he made an error. Instead of cura animarum, care of souls, he wrote cura animalium, care of animals. He caught it instantly. His hand trembled. Rather than scrape it, he lifted a clean blade and gently shaved the ink from the surface. Then he reapplied the line, slower this time. Later in the margin, he wrote in tiny script, "Animalium corrected, but are not animals in need of care too?" No one would ever read that note. But for Brother Alcuin, it mattered. Evening, the bell and the breath. As the sun dipped low behind the cloister wall, the bell rang for vespers. The scribes cleaned their quills, capped their ink, and stood. Brother Alcuin stretched slowly, his back creaking like the oak beams overhead. He tucked his tablet into his satchel, wrapped the unfinished folio in linen, and bowed toward the altar in the scriptorium's corner. He had written 378 words that day. 7 corrections, 2 marginalia notes, 1 page illuminated with a red capital letter, the only color allowed that day. As he walked through the cloister garden, the basil plants brushed against his sleeve, releasing their scent. He would return tomorrow. The text would still be there. Waiting. If the words are not copied, are they still heard by God? In the 6th week after Easter, the gardens of Abbey St. Martin bloomed with early herbs sage, rue, rosemary, and wild mustard. The monks spoke of planting cycles, liturgical feasts, and weather omens from the sky's color at dawn. But within the scriptorium, the world remained unchanged. There were no seasons in ink, no moon phases in vellum, only the line, the margin, and the slow march of illuminated words copied one by Brother Alcuin, monk and scribe, guardian of quiet truths. While outside, the Carolingian Empire moved with growing ambition, its bishops expanding influence. Its armies pacifying the Saxons. Alcuin's kingdom consisted of one knife, one quill, a bottle of ink, and a page waiting to be filled. An accumulation of hours. The work of the scriptorium was not merely to replicate holy texts, but to create a continuity of memory, an unbroken chain between the past and the present. But such chains were only as strong as the precision of the link. And precision, Alcuin knew, could be lost not by rebellion but by fatigue. Each scribe kept a rough count of how many lines they could write before errors crept in. Alcuin's count was 11. After 11 lines, he sharpened his quill, sipped water, and rolled his shoulders before continuing. In the margin of his tablet, he noted, "Line 11, 3rd hour, hand stiff, redip every second letter." He also tracked ink consistency at different times of day, sunlight angles on his corner of the desk, fatigue patterns based on liturgical fasting days. All scribes copied the same text, but only Alcuin charted the conditions of his copying. The calendar project. Midway through the month, the abbey received a request from Corby Abbey, 3 days ride east. Send a complete liturgical calendar illuminated. Include feast days, martyrs, saints of the Gaulish provinces. Style, Roman order. Hand, minuscule. It was a complex task. A calendar was not just dates, it was theology expressed through arrangement. When to fast. When to feast. When to mourn. When to copy, and when to burn incense. Brother Alcuin was chosen for the task. Not because he was fast, because he was accurate. Building the calendar. Each day, Alcuin added 1 month. He worked from August, not January, mirroring the Roman fiscal year. He drafted each saint's feast day with cautious spacing, leaving room for local additions Corby might make later. He cross-referenced 3 existing calendars. One from the Abbey of Fulda, with dense script. One from Tours, gifted years ago by a bishop. One partial fragment writ in a now outlawed Merovingian hand. The last made his work difficult. The old script, narrow and serpentine, was difficult to read. He studied the letters with a magnifying glass made from polished glass, brought back by a traveling monk from Hispania. In the margin he wrote, Merovingian S for Sanctus, easily mistaken for T. Proceed with caution. A mistake with the moon. Calendrical work involved not only saints but the lunar cycle. Easter must always fall on the first Sunday after the Paschal full moon. Misplacing the moon meant heretical misalignment and potential condemnation from bishops. One day, Alcuin noticed a mistake in a source scroll. Luna XXII entered for 12th day of Martius, but lunar tables say XXIV. He paused. If he copied it faithfully, he preserved the error, but if he corrected it, he might be altering the word. He brought the question to the abbot. After a long silence, the abbot replied, "Write both, note the conflict, do not resolve it." And so he did. Luna XXII, XXIV as per divergent sources, resolution left to the reader. This entry, centuries later, would be cited in a study of Carolingian astronomical practice. Alcuin would never know. The red and the gold. Illumination using color and metal leaf to highlight key letters or headings was rare and costly, but Corby had requested elevated headings for the great feasts. Alcuin used red ink made from powdered cinnabar, gold pressed leaf fixed with egg white and glue, blue sparingly applied, sourced from lapis chips diluted in wine. He painted with a squirrel hair brush, trembling slightly from age and effort. His favorite was the initial for the Nativity, a large N intertwined with vines, beneath which he wrote, Natus est nobis salvator, unto us a Savior is born. He added a tiny owl, his personal symbol, hidden in the foliage of the N, a signature of sorts. Not vanity, just memory. Wear and tear. After 2 weeks, his hand cramped. The ink had begun to stain his fingers permanently. The callus on his middle finger cracked and bled slightly. He wrapped it in a strip of linen and continued working. On his wax tablet he noted, ink stings wound, keep clean, write with less pressure. The unspoken reflection. During Compline, as the monks chanted the final prayers of the day, Alcuin sat alone near the cloister garden, watching the reflected moonlight on the stone basin. He thought not of saints or feasts or kings. He thought of how many words he had copied that no one had ever read, how many pages would be tucked away, stored, then forgotten. But still he knew. He had preserved something. A voice, a season, a single line that might have otherwise disappeared. Let this calendar not be perfect, he whispered in Latin. Let it be faithful. Is a word holy because it is read or because it is remembered, letter by letter, even in silence? The year had turned. The calendar brother Alcuin had copied carefully, line by line, saint by saint was sent off to Corby Abbey, bound in oxhide and wrapped in linen. No reply came. No letter of thanks, no acknowledgement of receipt. It was not unexpected. For a scribe, the act of copying was its own end. The work was its own prayer. Still, as the winter months returned and the sun retreated behind heavy clouds, a cold doubt began to creep between the lines of his daily copying. Was his work truly seen? Was it useful? Was it ever opened? The Lost Psalter. One morning just after matins, the abbot approached with a wrapped bundle. Inside, a damaged psalter, pages half torn and curling from moisture. It came from a traveling monk, found in a burned abbey. Recopy what can be saved. Alcuin turned the brittle pages carefully, brushing away ash and insect husks. Some words were still legible. Others were half melted, fused to the page like wax. He examined the script. It was not minuscule. It was the same cramped Merovingian script he had once struggled to decipher. In the margin of the opening page, scrawled in faded ink, was a note. God preserve what is left of our memory. Alcuin paused. This book had been written by another scribe in another abbey, possibly decades before. That scribe's name was forgotten, his abbey burned, his margins unread. Yet here it was, returned to ink, rescued by memory, about to be copied again. Repairing the forgotten. The Psalter's restoration became Alcuin's main project. Unlike copying a clean text, this required judgment. He had to guess missing words, reconstruct letters from damaged forms. In some cases, he inserted brackets with alternate possibilities. Dominus Muse. Miserere me Deus. He added footnotes. Reconstruction based on common Psalter forms. Gap estimated to be 5 letters. Context suggests Venite. This was not creative work. It was archaeological scribe work, quiet, slow, and filled with hesitation. Some brothers objected. You cannot guess the word. The abbot replied. He does not guess, he remembers in hope. The scriptorium in winter. By late December, the scriptorium grew unbearably cold. The inkwells froze, pages cracked from dry air, lamps smoked and stung the eyes. Still, Alcuin came each morning. He adapted. warmed ink with a small clay pot filled with coals, kept vellum pressed between stones to avoid curling, wrote with 2 fingers gloved, leaving only the tip exposed. He no longer copied full folios, his hands tired quickly. But he began something else. A personal book. The little book of margins. It was small, just 8 leaves of scrap vellum, stitched together with sinew. He called it Memorial Marginum, the memorial of margins. Inside he wrote the best and worst ink batches, names of scribes he had worked beside, a list of saints whose feast days he'd copied more than 10 times, observations about how different types of vellum reacted to ink. But also, never copy when sad, the hand betrays the heart. Speak no praise of the page until the ink has dried. The word belongs to the breath, but we who write lend it form. A new novice. That spring, a young novice named Irembert was assigned to the scriptorium. He was clumsy and impatient, constantly redipping his quill, smudging letters and miscounting lines. Alcuin watched him quietly for 2 weeks. Then, without being asked, he gave him the Memorial Marginum. "Start your own version," he said. "You'll need it." Irembert looked surprised. "But it's yours." "Not anymore," Alcuin said. "Margins belong to those who write beside them." The last page. In his final month of work, Alcuin completed a single page. Not a full book, just a page. It was the opening to the book of Job, written in large, careful minuscule. Verirat in terra Uz namen Job. There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job. He adorned it with a quiet illumination, a single sprig of vine growing out from the V of Ver. It was the last illumination he ever made. At the bottom, in very small letters, he wrote, "Who writes the sufferer's name keeps his memory alive." After Alcuin, he died quietly, one summer evening during Compline. No official record marked the day. The Abbey chronicler noted, "Brother Alcuin, long in the scriptorium, passed into the next world. No novelties recorded." But Irembert remembered. And years later, when the Abbey's book inventory was reviewed, scholars noticed something peculiar. In the margins of over 40 books, there were quiet notes. "Ink slightly too thick today." "Rainy morning," letters curled inward. The word remains, the weather changes. The same hand, the same voice, repeated again and again. Is the one who writes forgotten words truly forgotten himself, or does the line preserve the hand behind it, even when no one speaks the name? The sun had only just begun to rise over the desert when the copper dome of the Ulugh Beg Observatory shimmered into view, a quiet silhouette against the dusted sky of 15th century Samarkand. It was the year 1423 CE. The famed Silk Road city still glimmered with the wealth of Timur's empire, but the man now shaping its skyline was not a warrior or conqueror. He was a mathematician, a scholar, an astronomer, and tucked in one of the side rooms of his growing observatory was a quiet man with a peculiar obsession, measuring time not through prayer, not through ritual, but through mechanics. This man's name was Hassan al-Qasari. He was not one of the celebrated astronomers in Ulugh Beg's court. He had no published star tables or noble lineage. He was simply a watchmaker. Samarkand's silent revolution. To understand Hassan's world, you must first imagine Samarkand not as a city of noise, but of observation. Scholars in the madrasa recited trigonometric proofs, allowed to memorize sine tables. Astronomers climbed ladders to take readings from a 90-foot sextant, carved into the observatory itself. The muekkit, timekeeper of the mosque, coordinated the 5 daily calls to prayer based on celestial calculations. Time in Samarkand was not philosophical. It was celestial discipline, and it required precision. But even among these minds, Hassan stood apart. Because he didn't use stars. He used wheels. The workshop, Hassan's corner of the observatory, wasn't much to look at. A stone room, partially underground to protect against sandstorms. Shelves lined with brass gears, weights, and rolled parchment scrawled with tables and half-drawn schematics. The centerpiece was a half-finished mechanical timekeeper, a kind of water-driven astrolabic clock, designed to keep time without needing direct celestial observation. Such devices existed in earlier Islamic science, most notably those of al-Jazari and Banu Musa, but they were rarely replicated. Hassan's goal wasn't novelty. His aim was replication, standardization, reliability. He wanted a clock that could be used by a mosque muezzin or a caravan leader, built with local parts, repaired without royal engineers. But the work was slow. Daily routine of a quiet tinker. Hassan's days followed a rigid schedule, ironically reliant on the very celestial rhythms he wished to replace. Before dawn, rise with the call to prayer, drink sour milk and barley porridge. Sunrise, inspect the weights and balance of his current build, make small adjustments to pendulums. Late morning, study ancient Persian and Greek treatises on hydraulics, timekeeping, and gearing. Midday, visit the main observatory chamber, take observational readings from astronomers to calibrate his designs. Afternoon, return to his shop, record the drift in his test clock from actual solar time. Evening, tinker with escapement mechanisms under the dim light of an oil lamp. Night, read, reflect, write notes in the margins of al-Jazari's mechanical manuscripts. His neighbors found him peculiar. He often muttered time intervals under his breath. 1/8 turn per 90 seconds. Adjust water flow rate by 1 finger width. The apprentices called him al-Majnun al-Zaman, the time-crazy one. The Ulug Beg problem. Hassan faced a persistent challenge. Solar time was not constant. The length of a solar day shifted slightly over the course of the year, and the Islamic prayer schedule, tied to the sun's motion, complicated his efforts to define mechanical regularity. One afternoon, an astronomer from the observatory, Ali al-Kashani, visited his workshop. "Your clock drifts by 4 minutes in winter," Ali said. "Because the sun is drifting," Hassan replied. "The sun has more authority than gears," Ali said with a smirk. It stung, but it was true. So Hassan began adjusting his designs not to mimic the sky, but to account for its inconsistencies. He drafted a rotating camshaft system that modulated gear ratios through the seasons. He called it the compensator. The ink-stained fingers of trial and error. Hassan kept painstaking logs of every test. One notebook preserved to this day in fragments reads, "Day 103, clock loses 11 minutes by end of day. Suspect water viscosity affected by morning chill. Day 104, added heating stone under water basin. Drift reduced to 6 minutes. Day 105, replaced reed outlet with bronze. No improvement. Day 106, begin drafting escapement wheel inspired by al-Jazari's elephant clock. His fingers were stained with ink and brass polish. His lungs often wheezed from fine metal dust. Yet he pressed on. The timekeeper's dilemma. Hassan knew he would never perfect timekeeping. Even water seemingly stable evaporated faster in summer. Gears expanded in heat and contracted in the cold. Sand grains could block outlets. Weights could degrade ropes. He spent 2 weeks trying different counterweight materials from lead to baked clay, all to ensure a steady tick. Not that his clock made noise. It moved silently, like a moon dial spinning in a hidden room. A curious visitor. One day, a Persian nobleman visiting the observatory wandered into Hassan's shop. He stared at the brass gears and dripping funnels. What does this machine do? Hassan hesitated, then answered plainly. It keeps time even when the stars hide. The nobleman nodded, bemused. But if the stars are hidden, perhaps it is time to rest. Hassan didn't respond, but that night in his journal he wrote, "The stars do not hide. They wait, but men sleep. Clocks must not." The unfinished clock. By the end of the year, Hassan's latest design was almost ready. A water-regulated, cam-modulated dual-gear escapement clock 1 that could maintain an average drift of less than 5 minutes per day over a full seasonal cycle. It was the best he'd ever made. He named it simply Al-Waqt Al-Samid, Time That Stands. But he wasn't ready to show it. Not yet. Not until he solved one final issue, the evening reset mechanism, which jammed after 3 rotations. Can time ever be trusted to a machine built by imperfect hands, or must it always belong to the stars above? The morning breeze in Samarkand often arrived before the sun. It carried with it the scent of stone dust, lamp oil, and overripe dates from the vendor carts lining the lower bazaar. But inside the quiet chamber of Hassan al-Kasari's workshop, the air smelled only of metal filings, parchment, and focused failure. Failure not in the grand sense no disaster had occurred, but in the tiny betrayals of movement and measure. For weeks now, Hassan had worked on a small but crucial innovation, an automatic reset mechanism designed to recalibrate his timekeeping device at dusk each day. And each night, the mechanism jammed. He tried. A rotating ratchet activated by water flow. A swinging pendulum release triggered by weighted descent. Even a heat-activated wax fuse, inspired by a Persian incense timer. None had worked. Each night the brass cams groaned and ground, then stopped. Each morning, Hassan returned to a mechanism frozen, in confusion, like a man who had walked a mile and forgotten why. The monastery's request. In the middle of his mechanical frustration, a new challenge arrived. A letter, sealed with beeswax, from the monastery of Ishrat Khana, a small but historically significant religious center east of Samarkand. Their muezzin had died. They needed a new timekeeping method to regulate the calls to prayer, especially during overcast days when the sun's position could not be observed. The letter concluded, "If such a clock as yours can keep prayer in harmony with heaven, we would be honored to receive it." It was the first time someone had asked not why he built clocks, but whether he could share one. Hassan sat with the letter for some time, then made a decision. He would build a version of his Al-Waqt Al-Samid, simplified, durable, and suited for the routines of a monastic courtyard. It had to endure weather, dust, hands less precise than his own. And it had to reset each night, no exceptions. Reworking the reset. Driven by necessity, Hassan returned to his unfinished mechanism. His latest inspiration came from an unlikely place, an olive press he'd seen during a visit to a village south of the city. The press used a counterweight lever to slowly reset itself between loads. The movement was slow, deliberate, and surprisingly consistent. Hassan began reworking the mechanism, using a similar approach. A descending weight to slowly wind a spring. A safety release catch to prevent overwind. A ratcheted disc that gradually unwound at a fixed pace during night hours. He called it Allah to the Return. To test it, he created a miniaturized mock-up using wood, lead, and copper wire. Then, in the corner of his room, he placed a candle calibrated to burn for exactly 8 hours, a common timekeeping tool in regions where mechanical clocks were unavailable. That night, as the candle flickered lower, Hassan watched his new mechanism begin its slow descent. He did not sleep. Notes from the candle watch. In his notebook, dated 17th Shaban, 826 AH, August 1423 CE, Hassan wrote, "Reset initiated at sunset. Return mechanism engaged with minor shudder. Rate of descent consistent with prior test. Audible click at midpoint. No stall. Later entries. Observed minor friction at third hour. Applied olive oil to ratchet. Candle extinguished. Reset completed. Time discrepancy less than 2 minutes. For the first time in weeks, he closed his book with satisfaction. Not perfection, but consistency. The monastic build. The next morning, Hassan cleared his workbench and began building the Ishrat Khana clock from scratch. It differed from his personal version in several key ways. No exposed gear teeth to prevent dust clogging. Simpler reset system with weight-based rather than hydraulic timing. Call to prayer bell triggers linked to adjustable cams for seasonal calibration. Instruction tablet written in Persian with diagrams for winding and calibration. He built it in 26 days, then crated it in oiled wool and sealed it with his maker's mark, a tiny etching of an hourglass wrapped in ivy, based on a doodle he once made as a boy. He sent it by camel, along with a message. This timekeeper will not replace the stars, but it may speak when they are silent. The observatory's silence. During these weeks, the main Ulugh Beg observatory remained strangely quiet. The prince himself had traveled to Bukhara to negotiate the donation of astronomical manuscripts, and many of the scholars had gone with him. Hassan missed their noise, the half-spoken calculations, the muttering over astrolabe readings, the sharp thwack of parchment being unrolled. But in the stillness, his mind sharpened. He began writing his own manual, not a treatise, but a quiet instructional guide for practical horology. He titled it Fitartib al-Azman, on the arrangement of times. It began not with a discussion of gears, but with this. There are 2 types of time, one for heaven and one for hands. Both must be tended. A visit from a scholar. Toward the end of the season, Ali al-Kashani returned from Bukhara and visited Hassan. The astronomer seemed genuinely surprised by the progress. So, the machine now knows when to sleep. Hassan smiled. It does not know, but it remembers. Ali walked around the workshop, inspecting the various components. He stopped before the schematic for al-Auda. This reset mechanism, you should present it to the madrasa. It is not beautiful, Hassan replied, just reliable. That's what makes it revolutionary. Ali paused. You're not just building a timekeeper, Hassan. You're building resistance to forgetfulness. Between heaven and earth. That night, Hassan wrote in his journal, no machine will ever replace the stars, but perhaps in the gap between prayers, between moments of sight, between storm and clear sky, it may stand witness. Not as a master of time, but as its servant. And then, my hands do not move as they once did, but the wheels still turn. When the stars are silent and the sky is hidden, what speaks for time? A bell, a gear, or the hand that set them in motion? The days turned cooler in Samarkand. The sky, once cloudless, became a sheet of shifting silver. Dust storms gave way to chilled winds, and the lanterns in the observatory were lit earlier each evening. Somewhere in the monastery of Ishrat Khana, a bell now rang at predictable intervals, guided not by the shifting hues of twilight, but by a mechanism forged in brass and patience. Hassan al-Kasari did not hear it, but he knew it rang. The final adjustment. With the monastery clock complete and functioning, Hassan turned his attention back to his own device. Al-Waqt al-Samid, the silent, intricate timekeeper, meant not for prayer alone, but for long observation, study, and memory. He had one goal left. It wasn't technical. It was philosophical. He wanted to teach the machine to wait. Time that knows stillness. A flaw he observed in many timekeeping designs, even his own, was the assumption of perpetual motion. Gears always turned. Water always flowed. Time marched on without pause. But Hassan believed there were moments when nothing should move. When a scholar prayed, when the desert wind howled too loudly, when a child cried in the courtyard, or when an observer, gazing through a lens, held their breath to measure a star. He devised a mechanism, a pause gear, manually triggered that would stop the escapement wheel without resetting the count. A physical suspension of time's progress, yet with memory intact. He engraved a phrase on the mechanism's base. Al-Sukun Baina al-Dakatain. The stillness between the ticks. The young apprentice. Around this time, a young student named Ramat was assigned to assist in the lower chambers of the observatory. At just 12, he was too young for the more complex astronomical work, but curious enough to drift into Hassan's workshop. At first he swept. Then he fetched parts. Soon he asked questions. Why do you need two types of weight for the same wheel? What happens if the sand is wet? Why is this spring coiled like a snail shell? Hassan answered each with a kind of reverent calm. But when Ramat asked, "Who will use your clock after you?" Hassan paused. Maybe no one, or maybe someone I'll never meet. Ramat furrowed his brow. Then why build it at all? Hassan replied quietly. Because one day someone will not know when it is, and this machine will say, "It is now." The observers return. When Ulugh Beg returned to Samarkand, he brought with him new charts, star tables from Persia, and several gifted scholars. Among them was a renowned timekeeper from Shiraz, Mufti Basir al-Din, known for his precise sun dials and complex celestial spheres. Basir visited the observatory scriptorium first, then the upper dome. Finally, he was brought to Hassan's chamber. He inspected Al-Waqt al-Samid carefully, said nothing for several minutes. Then, in a tone not of scorn, but contemplation, he asked, "Why does it not ring?" Hassan replied, "Because it is not a teacher, it is a mirror." Basir nodded once, then walked to the reset mechanism and gently triggered the pause gear. He listened to the stillness. "It waits," he said, smiling. "Not bad. Time's quietest legacy." Hassan's health declined slowly. There was no illness, only the quiet wearing down of years spent in a chamber filled with dust, brass, and silence. He wrote less, spoke even less than that. But every day, until he could no longer stand, he wound the clock, not because it needed winding. It was, by then, self-regulating through water and balance weights. But because the act itself measured him. After Hassan, when he passed, Ramat inherited the workshop not officially, but by habit. The others saw him as Hassan's shadow, and no one else dared take the space. Ramat maintained the clock, made copies of the instruction scrolls, and added his own notes in a newer dialect of Persian. But Al-Waqt al-Samid was never reproduced. It remained unique. It did not tick loudly. It did not chime on the hour. It marked time in movement alone, its hands shifting like shadows on ancient walls. Centuries later, when the observatory lay buried under wind-blown sand and later rediscovered by archaeologists, they found fragments of the large sextant, bits of glazed tile, and rusted tools. But in the lower chamber deep in stone they found a sealed brass casing within it, a gear system, coiled springs, a pause lever, and a faint engraving. This machine is not for rulers or scholars. It is for the moment that forgets the hour.